Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane. It's the morning of Friday, the 18th of January, 2019. And it's a mild, if somewhat damp morning down here in the southwest of England. But I'm pleased to say that the awning of my caravan has survived since I had to go through somewhat of a massive rebuilding process the last time I was down in the southwest. I was here to do an episode of Humanity versus Insanity last night in the UK Column Studios in Plymouth, and I would encourage people to watch that full episode as I covered a number of issues. But the final part of that presentation, bear with me. Right. The final item that I discussed last night was Hillsborough. And of course, this is extremely pertinent because the trial of former Chief Superintendent, former Commander David Duckenfield is going on right now at Preston Crown Court. And today in The Guardian, the lead article there is Hillsborough trial. Police chief unfairly singled out, the court is told. And let me just read you the first few paragraphs of this. The manslaughter prosecution against David Duckenfield, the former South Yorkshire police officer in command at Hillsborough, when 96 people were killed in a crush, is unfair, his barrister argued. Ben Myers, QC, setting out the issues on which he will base Duckenfield's defence, says he was being singled out unfairly, that many other people made mistakes and other factors contributed to the disaster, including the behaviour of some Liverpool Football Club supporters. Well, that old chestnut, of course, that was the Rupert Murdoch line back in 1989, where Murdoch attempted to put all the blame on Liverpool supporters, and to this day, you would struggle to find a newsagent in the Liverpool area that will stock the Sun. And if you're walking around with the Sun in Liverpool, then you might find yourself getting a bit of rightly due, perhaps, abuse. So what's really occurring here? Is Duckenfield being made a scapegoat? Well, there is now an increasing amount of evidence coming into the public domain which would suggest that indeed he is. And one has to ask why it is that he has remained silent and refused to share what he knows really occurred on that day back in April 1989. And I've been sitting on some of this for a little over 8 years now, because back in mid-2011, I assisted Tony Farrell and acted as his Mackenzie friend at his employment tribunal following his dismissal from South Yorkshire Police. And he was dismissed from his role as a principal criminal analyst, and his job was to aid South Yorkshire Police and help them determine what resources they needed, where best to position their resources, etc., based on his analysis. Well, he was commissioned in 2008, I believe it was, or 2009, to do a study on the potential risk of terrorism from the Islamic community in South Yorkshire. And he was given pretty open access. He was very highly regarded in South Yorkshire Police, and he was given access to documents that are still not to this day in the public domain. And following his analysis, he established beyond any reasonable doubt in his mind that there was actually no risk whatsoever from the Muslim community in South Yorkshire, but any risk of terrorism in the UK was more likely to come from rogue elements within the British security services pursuing an agenda to support the political agenda. Well, obviously that report didn't go down too well, and he got dismissed because the report didn't say what the establishment wanted it to say. But Tony, being true to his heart, knew that he had to stand by his truth. And he also came up, following his research, with the observation that the London bombings of 7/7 could not have been perpetrated by the 4 young Muslims that were allegedly responsible. And of course, this coming from somebody so highly regarded in the British police establishment was going to be a bit of a problem. So they terminated his employment and attempted to demonize him and dismiss him, and of course accused him of suffering from a mental breakdown. Well, whilst I was working with Tony, obviously I came into contact with a number of people who were ex-South Yorkshire police. And what was consistent was their version of what occurred at Hillsborough back in 1989. And without exception, every single one of them stated that this was a massive cover-up, and that, what had been perpetrated was a total travesty. Well, since my time with Tony back in 2011, Tony has spent some time in Ireland with a guy by the name of John Anthony Hill, who also uses the name of Muad'Dib. And Muad'Dib has produced a documentary called the Hillsborough Ripple Effect. And John Anthony Hill, along with Tony, have done even more research, dug even deeper, and come up with some truly disturbing but extremely compelling evidence. The evidence being that Hillsborough was a contrived event. Now, it was never intended that 96 people would die. It was a contrived event that got out of hand. And the purpose of the event was indeed to create sufficient groundswell amongst the British public to allow Margaret Thatcher to pursue the agenda to establish all-seater stadia at the top flight of British football. Now, this was being resisted at the time by the clubs because obviously of the cost of going to all-seater, not only in terms of potential lost revenue, because numbers would be reduced in terms of ground capacity, but also obviously the cost of actually converting the existing terraces to seating facilities. So the intention was to create a crush, which led to a few injuries, some broken bones perhaps, and disturbingly even accepted that the possibility of 1 or 2 deaths, but that would be sufficient to then get the public opinion behind the agenda for all-seater stadia. And the reason that Liverpool were chosen to be the victims of this agenda was following the events at Hazel back in 1985, where it's alleged that the Liverpool fans were responsible for triggering the unfortunate events at the ground in Heysel. So this was considered like retribution, for the Liverpool fans. So some of them suffered, well, tough. So obviously this could not be perpetrated without the connivance of the police. And the person that John Anthony Hill has identified in his documentary as most likely to be the police liaison with those who were pushing this agenda was Assistant Chief Constable Walter Jackson. Now, Walter Jackson is not on trial. It's David Duckenfield. And David Duckenfield had been promoted to the rank of, I believe it was Chief Inspector, just 19 days before the Hillsborough disaster. He had no experience of being a commander at any soccer match, and certainly not one of this importance. So he was, I believe, and John Anthony Hill believes, not necessarily involved, and in fact, may not have been involved at all, and just the unfortunate person assigned. Now, Walter Jackson, who John Anthony Hill rightly states was up in the control room, when he saw what was unfolding, he became an absolute gibbering wreck, and basically hid under the tables in the control room. And when Duckenfield actually sent a runner up to the control room to find out what was going on, because they were getting no response on their radios, they weren't even allowed through the door. So it was left to the officers on the ground at the Leppings Lane end to make the decisions. And unfortunately, of course, they had no experience of this type of situation, and it just went from bad to worse. Now, I would implore people to watch this documentary. It runs for just over an hour and a half, and the level of detail showing the connections of all the people involved or likely to be involved, not just in planning this scheme, but then in the cover-up. And of course, to maintain the cover-up and the silence within the police, then we go to Freemasonry. And then we look at who it was part of the police Freemasonry organization. And certainly back in the 80s, if you wanted to get above the rank of sergeant, then you basically had to be on the square. So understanding the beliefs of the upper echelons of Freemasonry, was this a ritual that was going to involve minor human sacrifice? In the best possible case, that was going to just involve some maybe a few serious injuries. In the worst possible case, but it may involve a couple of deaths. But as I said, it got out of hand. But their belief system, of course, is if they in the upper echelons, not in the lower blue degrees, but in the upper echelons, if you can create the sacrifice, then you are rewarded financially. Perverse though it may seem to the vast majority of people, and it doesn't matter if it's true, that's what these socio-psychopaths believe. So, the people that really should be looked at more closely are the Chief Constable at the time, Peter Wright, the Deputy Chief Constable, Peter Hayes, and of course the Assistant Chief Constable, Walter Jackson, and the South Yorkshire Police Solicitor at the time, Peter Metcalfe. So none of these people are on trial, but obviously Duckenfield has been put forward, clearly told that he has to keep his mouth shut, and that he'll be taken care of provided he plays the game. And what we're going to see unfold at Hillsborough is at Preston Crown Court is likely to be little more than showcasing to try to put this at rest in the minds of the public, and not least the friends and relatives of the 96 people who tragically were killed on that day in April in 1989. So I think I'm going to also take the opportunity to acknowledge that this trial would not even be taking place were it not for the persistence of Andy Burnham, who is today the current mayor of Manchester, because it was primarily due to Burnham's tenacity that the inquiry was held in 2012. Of course, that was an absolute whitewash, like all public inquiries. And of course, whoever is put in the position of chair of these inquiries is only put in that place because they're a safe pair of hands. And that's why we see, chairs of these inquiries sometimes take the role and then resign just a few months or, maybe a year later, just like the child abuse inquiry that Theresa May attempted to establish when she was Home Secretary. But, the likelihood of ever hearing anything from that inquiry that was meaningful was slim to none. So this documentary, it's called The Hillsborough Ripple Effect. And although it's been up on YouTube for, I think, a little over a year now, and, I've taken the opportunity a couple of times just to test the water and shared it around, but there's not really been the traction. But now, with this trial taking place at Preston Crown Court, it's time for people to truly take a look at the degree to which the state and the corporatocracy in collusion with the state and the state's enforcement officers, i.e. in this case South Yorkshire Police, will collude to bring about an agenda. And if it means that there is loss of human life, well, that's just collateral loss, collateral damage. So, whether or not the work of John Anthony Hill, the revelations that Tony Farrell and others have brought into the public domain will get any traction in the short term, very much depends on each and every one of us and upon the people in Liverpool in particular, because obviously, that is the city that was effectively targeted to be the sacrifice for the corporatist agenda. And in the documentary, John Anthony Hill identifies the individuals who were driving this agenda to get all-seater stadia in place in the UK. Now, in the scheme of things, obviously, I think most people would agree that all-seater stadia at this level is a good idea. But the methodology by which it was achieved in this country is a absolute travesty. But it is also a classic example of how the state, the corporatocracy, and the secret societies such as Freemasonry, and of course another one at a different level is Common Purpose, but how these fraternities work to control who knows what, who says what, and who gets to chair these inquiries to make sure that what's put out in the public domain follows the party line. So 30 years on, maybe, just maybe, thanks to Tony Farrell and John Anthony Hill, just maybe, the truth might just emerge. But it isn't going to come through the lamestream media, and it's highly unlikely that any politician, even Andy Burnham, is going to risk pushing the envelope to this degree without massive public pressure. So we have to create the pressure here from the ground up. So I'm going to sign off now, and I'm going to put the link to this documentary under the video, and I'm going to implore you, sometime over the course of the weekend, watch this documentary. It's not an easy watch. It takes a while to get going, but when you've sat through an hour and 34 minutes or so of this documentary, you're going to literally go, oh my God. And if anyone wants to put counter evidence out there, of course, that suggests that Tony Farrell, remember, who was deep inside South Yorkshire Police as a principal criminal analyst, a very highly regarded principal criminal analyst, until such time as he went against the party line. Their word, for me, has much greater substance than anything that comes out of the mouth of a politician, a police officer, or a member of the judiciary. You have a great weekend, and I will catch with you on Monday morning at 8:30. You take care now.